A young woman was led down a long prison corridor. She appeared to be just over 20, which greatly surprised the guards. However, that wasn't what the guards found the most shocking. Over the years of working within the walls of the state county jail, they thought they had seen it all. But it wasn't about the prisoner's age. The prosecutors who sent Nancy Miller to jail had strongly recommended placing her in a male block rather than a female one, as was customary in such cases. The guards exchanged puzzled looks, but proceeded to obey the senior officer's order. There are no words to describe what poor Nancy was feeling at that time. It was a real disaster for the young woman. She knew that being in the same cell with hardened male criminals was extremely dangerous, especially for a woman whose guilty verdict was clearly a stretch. Nancy walked down the corridor and silently prayed for divine intervention. She knew that the all-powerful prosecutor had put considerable effort into locking her up. Thus, she understood that her trials were just beginning. Laughing openly at the newcomer, the guards made bets on how long she would last in the male block. However, one of the younger guards seemed to sympathize with the unfortunate woman. Seizing the moment, he touched Nancy's arm and said, "If it gets too rough for you, let me know. Knock on the door and call for help." At that moment, the older colleague rudely interrupted him. "Bill, stop helping this criminal. They're all the same, you know. First they make you feel sorry for them, and then you're in for trouble." Nancy looked at the young guard with gratitude and winked at him discreetly. From that point on, Bill would be Nancy's only friend and protector in prison. And he would be doing it at his own risk, of course. Everyone knew that his partner George often reported on the prison staff, hoping to get a long-awaited promotion by supplying valuable information to the warden. The warden greatly appreciated George for providing such valuable information, but he clearly wasn't in a rush to promote him, intending to use him to his own advantage for as long as possible. Finally, the guard stopped in front of one of the cells. Being the senior officer, George removed a bunch of keys from his belt and began to unlock the door. Nancy looked at Bill sadly, then lowered her eyes. Why did she get involved with that prosecutor? Why didn't she just do what he wanted? Why did she have to put herself in harm's way? In response to Nancy's thoughts, there was a loud creak as the door lock disengaged. Then the door swung open with the final squeak from the unoiled hinges. "Well, come in, don't be afraid. I think you'll have quite a story to tell," said the senior guard as he pushed her inside. Nancy flinched and hesitated before stepping into the cell. At that moment, several pairs of eyes filled with intense interest turned to the newcomer. There was a woman in the male block for particularly dangerous criminals. This was unheard of, even amongst the most experienced inmates. Not knowing what would come next, Nancy took a few steps and prepared herself for the worst. The cell got instantly filled with an eerie silence. Nancy felt as if the inmates could hear her heart pounding, ready to leap out of her chest. Then a confident and slightly hoarse voice broke the silence. "Come on in, take an empty bed. Why are you standing there like a statue?" Nancy turned pale. Tears welled up in her eyes and her lips started trembling. She was terrified and expected an attack at any moment. However, to her immense surprise, the inmates took her appearance in the cell rather coldly. They were all hardened criminals who understood that Nancy didn't end up in their cell by accident. It could be a mistake or some sort of scheme to provoke them. After all, they knew that if something were to happen to the young female inmate, there would be no end to their problems. And the longer the rep sheet the inmates had, the more trouble they would be in. Meanwhile, Nancy found an empty bed and sat on it. Feeling like a black sheep, she didn't know what to think. Of course, she understood that her life was hanging by a thread. But on the other hand, Nancy hoped that the guard named Bill wouldn't abandon her and would come to her aid if needed. The inmates were literally devouring the newcomer with their eyes, but were hesitant to make any moves without the approval of their leader, who happened to be sharing their cell. Richard O'Donnell had spent a total of 30 years in correctional facilities, and at the age of 50, he knew the criminal world down to the smallest details. He immediately understood that Nancy didn't end up in their cell by accident. Therefore, the first thing he wanted to know was what Nancy had done on the outside to be placed within the walls of the state county jail's male block. Richard gestured to one of the inmates. and he quickly poured a cup of strong coffee for the newcomer. "Here, take this. Don't worry, it's not poisoned," the inmate added with a smile. Nancy obediently took the cup and took a small sip of the scorching, bitter drink. "Wow, that's better. Now tell us why you've joined us here. Don't be afraid, no one will touch you here. I give you my word," Richard added. The inmates mumbled under their breath but refrained from open protests. After all, Richard's authority within the prison walls was unquestionable. Thus, no one wanted to get involved with him over some woman. Nancy took another sip of her coffee and, having gathered her courage, began her story. She never knew her father. Her mother raised her alone until she was about 15. Then a man appeared in Amanda Miller's life. At first, Frank only came to visit on the weekends, but the longer he was in a relationship with Nancy's mother, the more frequent his visits became. Initially, Frank treated Nancy with respect. Perhaps he was only pretending, but at the time, the young girl didn't feel any negativity from him. However, when Frank moved in with them, everything changed for the worse. What used to be imperceptible now became glaringly obvious. Frank turned out to be a lazy, dissatisfied man who spent most of his time in front of the TV with a beer in a hand. Amanda Miller, on the other hand, worked as a cleaner at a roadside motel and returned home late in the evening. Meanwhile, Frank kept lying to her, telling her that he simply couldn't find a job. In reality, however, he never even tried. He spent his days at home, taking advantage of the fact that Amanda was working hard to support her family. Nancy, like any dutiful daughter, tried to tell her mother about it. However, instead of the response she expected, she encountered nothing but resistance from her stepfather, who already had a certain influence over her mother. The outcome of Amanda and Frank's union was dismal. Unbeknownst to herself, Amanda had developed a drinking problem, which in turn led to problems at work. Having fallen under Frank's influence, Amanda gradually deteriorated, much to Nancy's distress. Over time, the cunning stepfather deliberately drove a wedge between Amanda and her daughter to ensure that no one could speak out against them. Having graduated from high school, Nancy left home to live on her own. Unfortunately, the naive young woman had no idea what kind of difficulties she would encounter on her way to an independent life. The biggest challenges for the recent high school graduate was finding a job. Most employers were unwilling to hire a young woman with no work experience in the field. But Nancy didn't give up and earned a living however she could. She distributed promotional flyers in a makeshift fur costume, helped the janitor, and joined a volunteer organization. This continued until one day, Nancy was offered a very good job. It happened by chance when someone called in response to her ad in the local newspaper. As she would later find out, her employer was none other than the city prosecutor, David Stone, who offered her a position as a maid in his house. It goes without saying that Nancy immediately accepted the offer from such an influential man. David's wife had passed away 7 years ago, and he now lived in a luxurious mansion with his son, Chris. The prosecutor used to turn to the on-call cleaning services, but he eventually decided to hire a full-time maid for his home. By that time, Amanda Miller had already hit rock bottom. She had to give up her home for debt and was wandering the streets together with Frank. Nancy tried to reason with her mother, but each time she hit a wall of incomprehension. "Stay out of my life. I'll make my own decisions, thank you," Amanda would say, her appearance leaving much to be desired. It was then that Nancy realized that there was no going back to her old life. At first, she enjoyed working at the prosecutor's house. Mr. Stone paid well, and as long as the house was in working order, allowed her to leave work early. However, trouble came from where Nancy least expected it. It all started when Chris, the prosecutor's son, started showing interest in Nancy. They were roughly the same age and quickly developed an attraction for each other. The relationship between Nancy and Chris developed so quickly that it took them both by surprise. Chris genuinely believed that his father would respect his feelings. But things turned out to be very differently. David was beyond furious when he learned that his son intended to start a family with the maid. "What were you even thinking, son? Do you really want to spend your life with that cleaning lady? Is that what I've been raising you for all these years?" the prosecutor exclaimed. Chris turned pale. The young man least expected to see such a reaction from his father, who had always been his role model in everything. To Chris's credit, he didn't back down and continued to date Nancy. It was then that David decided to get rid of the maid. Not physically, of course. Instead, he planned on using his position and extensive connections. First, Mr. Stone accused Nancy of stealing a large amount of money that he kept in his safe. As expected, the young maid didn't even know where the safe was located. But that didn't stop the corrupt investigators. As it turned out, David Stone's testimony was enough to land Nancy in prison. Meanwhile, the prosecutor had only one condition, which would allow the poor woman to avoid going to prison. He wanted her to break up with his son once and for all. To Mr. Stone's disappointment, Nancy refused to make the deal and didn't betray her boyfriend. Chris, on the other hand, believed his father's lies and now saw her as nothing more than a thief. When Nancy finished her story, the cell fell silent. Richard furrowed his brow and glanced at his fellow inmates. A minute later, the cell started trembling from a unanimous burst of applause. The eyes of the inmate showed nothing but sympathy for the newcomer who had suffered for her love. But what Nancy said next shocked everyone even more. "I'm pregnant with Chris's child, and he doesn't even know about it and believes every word his father says," she added, now openly sobbing. Richard nodded sympathetically. Despite his criminal background, there were still remnants of kindness and justice left in his heart. Therefore, he decided to help Nancy seek justice. First, he forbade his fellow inmates from touching the young woman. Then he used his connections on the outside to send Chris a message about his girlfriend's pregnancy. When the prosecutor's son got the news, his happiness knew no bounds. It was only then that Chris realized that Nancy was set up. The only one behind it all was none other than his own father. David Stone's scheme was exposed, and Nancy only had to spend about a week in prison, after which she was released. During this time, no one in prison so much as looked the wrong way at her. As she bid farewell to Richard at the cell door, Nancy warmly thanked him for his help. The inmate smiled and wished for her to stay out of prison in the future. At the exit of the correctional facility, Nancy was greeted by Chris and his father. Having learned that the maid was pregnant with the son's child, David felt bad for what he had did and promised her all the assistance she needed. Nancy smiled, took her beloved's hand, and walked towards a new life, where there would be no guards, barbed wire, or unspoken cruel laws that ruled within prison walls.